Okay, Ponde, today's November 22nd, 2023. We're going to talk about your experience in the war. And as you know, we're going to try to send all this to the Tempelhof Museum in Berlin and to my friend over there, Bernd, and he's going to try to connect this to some research archives in Germany. Okay?
Okay.
Very good.
Well,
I actually want to start and ask you a couple questions a little bit before you joined the military. So, do you remember when war was declared with Germany?
no, I don't.
1940, FDR, well, Pearl Harbor.
Oh, yes, okay.
Do you remember anything about those
No,
first
I
days?
just remember the declaration of war. Since the Germans had already invaded Poland, Czechoslovakia, and all these other countries.
Do you remember where you were or how old you were?
I was probably 16 years old, very close to that.
And you were living in? Cruces?
Living in Las Cruces. Yes, I was junior high school, probably 15 in 9th grade.
Yeah. And so then your older brother joined the military, Ernest?
The older brothers, Tony in the Air Force, David in the Air Force, Ernest in the Army, Ruth in the Air Force.
They had gone in.
They had already joined, yes.
And what year did your brother join? Because you guys were living together, right, when he joined?
Yes. So he went over just before the Normandy invasion. He was he was a radio operator looking for German gun emplacements and calling in air fire and ground fire.
And then you told a story I'd like to get on here about going to the post office to check the list for the wounded.
They used to post it in and they would send one of us to check to see if Brother Ernest had been wounded or whatever was going on.
And so you did that sometimes?
Yes.
Okay. And so then you were you decided to join and enlist in the military.
Yes.
At how old were you?
I was 17. I was 17 years old. I was in 1944. I was in high school.
What was your thinking?
Was my thinking?
Mm-hmm.
Primarily to support my three brothers that were overseas. I felt I should do something along that line.
And you tried to join before, and they wouldn't let you in the first time?
Pardon?
You tried to join and they wouldn't let you in at first?
Well, yeah, I was 17 years old and I had to have a signature. So I said, if you can't get a signature, then we're going to enlist you, and then when you're 18 years old, we'll put you on active duty. So I was on reserve at the age of 17.
And you went, but you did get a signature?
No, I didn't.
No?
No, I waited till I was 18.
Why? Did your dad not sign, or you just couldn't get it?
I didn't, my father was going to sign, and I didn't want to have a meeting with him, an argument with him. So I decided, so they said, you're underage without a signature, we'll enroll you and put you on an active duty on reserve. When you're 18, you're ready to go.
And so you went, and when you actually, when you signed up and when you were inducted, you hadn't graduated from high school?
I had what?
Graduated from high school?
No, it was the second semester of my junior year, after Christmas.
Did you finish your junior year?
No, I didn't. No, because they said, we need, one of the reasons that I had joined and that they wanted me was that we were going to replace all the aircrews. There were thousands of men and aircraft that had been lost. And so I specifically requested aircrew training, which meant that I was going to go into engineering, Air Force engineering or flight training to replace pilots and engineers that had been lost during the war. So that's my primary purpose for that, and that's why they let me choose what I wanted to do.
And so you decided to put your schooling aside and...
Yes, and then I had a good background in math and science, so they said, let's go, you can enter training right away, and as soon as you're done, you can go overseas if your request is there. And I said, I want to go overseas as soon as my training is done, and that's what happened.
Did they say anything about you could finish high school when you get back? Did they?
Nothing. They didn't. I knew that probably I would come back to finish school. But I wasn't thinking that far ahead. My primary purpose was to join and support the war effort and support my brothers. And I had the background in science and mathematics to request specific assignment in the Air Force.
So when you signed up, the war was not over, right?
No, it was not. No, absolutely not.
And
it didn't end in 1945. I enlisted in 44.
Would you have preferred to go on to Japan or Germany, or did it not matter?
No, they didn't have a preference. What they said, we need aircrew members. Is that what you want to do? And I said, yes, that's what I want to do. I want to do pilot training. I had studied aircrew training manual that my mathematics instructor in high school had bought for me. He didn't have any money. I mean, he was getting probably $100 a month as a teacher, but he spent his own money and bought this manual, and it said aircrew training. And so he and I studied. He helped me study that together. He said, you have to complete your mathematics study, but you have to prepare. You've chosen this career in the Air Force, whatever service, you have to prepare for that at the same time that you do your mathematics.
So I want to get back to this issue of patriotism. And did you have a strong feeling that you wanted to beat Nazism or the Japanese military? Was that part of it, or was it more?
I don't think, I've thought about that a number of times. Yes, I was a good reader. I was aware of what was going on. I had wanted to fly since I was a little child, from watching birds, eagles, ducks, all those birds flying. And then when my brothers enlisted, I decided, okay, if the Air Force will give me an opportunity to fly, that's what I want to do. And that's the main purpose that I did it, plus supporting my brothers. And I don't think I was thinking in
political terms.
Politically or in patriotism. I don't recall that at all. That has never been part of the thing. So I don't think that was a very strong thing.
Did it impact you when you found out your brother was wounded?
Pardon?
When your brother Ernest was wounded, did that impact you?
Oh yes. Oh yeah. He and I were close together. We had lived together from the time I was 14 years old. So 15, 16, 17. He enlisted when he was 18, as soon as he graduated from high school. So he and I corresponded. I told him I was going to join the Air Force, and he said that will be better than what I'm doing, walking for 3 or 4 feet of snow, fighting in the mountains, not knowing, getting wounded, putting back in the trenches. So I said, that's what I want to do. So that probably was a big motivating factor. He and I were close, very supportive of each other. And then I knew when he left, I didn't have a home, so I went to an old high school, and that opened the opportunity to continue science and mathematics and automotive mechanics with a mechanical engineer, a brilliant mechanical engineer from Nottingham, England. So I was prepared.
So, and I just, then we'll end on this, but for the record, your brother was in the Army and he was in or around Normandy and in the Battle of the Bulge.
Yes, he was in the 7th Corps, which was part of General Patton's army, and he was in, we know of 6 major battles. He had 6 or 8 battle stars. He was wounded, we know at least once, and was awarded Purple Heart, but they sent him to hospital, repaired his wounds, and sent him back in. And he was in the Battle of Bastogne, where the Germans got all of their armor together and decided to defeat the Allies there. And his outfit, General Patton's tanks, stopped that drive, and he was part of that. That's where he was wounded severely. They were fighting in 4, 5, 6 feet of snow.
Okay. All right, we're going to switch now to when, so you enlisted into the military, and when you went from the United States to Germany, you were 18?
I was 18.
And you remember about, and it was 1945,
Yes,
and the war was over when you got on the boat to go to France.
yes.
And you were in the boat for a couple months or a couple weeks,
Couple of weeks.
and you landed. Tell me about arriving in France. Tell me about your arrival in Europe.
We knew where we were going. We were landing in France. It had been liberated, so we landed at the port of Le Havre, and we got there, and recalling that the war had just been over, there were several ships bottom side up in the harbor of Le Havre. So we spent almost a whole day until all day long until 2 o'clock in the morning when we debarked. The aircraft it landed, or the boat, we landed at the wharf and got out at that time, and immediately after receiving from the Red Cross, from the donor ladies, coffee and donuts, we boarded the train, and immediately they needed us, so they sent us into Germany right away through France.
And do you remember the month, the year, more or less, when you entered Germany? Approximately. It doesn't have to be exact.
It had to be early fall. It was foggy and cold and raining.
So fall of 1945.
Yes.
The war has been over a couple months, several months.
Yes.
Okay. And so any specific memories entering into Germany on the train?
Well, yes, I had a chance to observe Germany from a railroad car. We boarded not railroad coaches, we boarded boxcars full with hay, and we had our duffel bags and all our winter gear on, and got on at the port and just started going through Germany and through France and into Germany.
No heating in the boxcar?
No, none whatsoever. No heating, no hot food, nothing. We had K rations, and that's how we survived. We made a connection with the engineer of the German engineer of the locomotive, and we traded him K rations for hot coals in a container, metal container that he gave us, and we traded our rations for hot coals, and we made some tea and heated canned sausages and sandwiches and whatever was in those K rations.
You mentioned that you'd seen evidence of bombing right away in Germany.
Oh yeah, Oh, the destruction was mind-blowing. It really was, because we could look across and see 3 or 4 feet of buildings left there. The huge buildings, stone buildings that had been completely destroyed by the armadas of bombers, by the primarily the Americans and British, but the French were also part of that.
You have an art piece you did about some helmets on
The what?
helmets on rifles.
Well, yeah. I think one of the, and I've written about this and I made some drawings. We were going through Germany, through France. I remember this clearly now. We went through a tunnel that had been repaired, because all of the tunnels, railroad, bridges, all ground transportation had been totally obliterated, just destroyed. So they had repaired this engine, and it had bullet holes all over the engine, and they had repaired it to hold steam to drive the engine. And we went through a tunnel, and that's a very fundamental feeling that I had. We could hear, the European trains have whistles that are totally different from America. So we went into this tunnel and out of it, and the sound enhanced. And as we came out of the tunnel, we came into this beautiful valley out of this tunnel. We were on the east side of this beautiful valley. The east side I remember because the sun was shining across this gorgeous valley. But as we came out of there, I was standing in the doorway of that boxcar, and I still remember the shock. I looked down, and the train had slowed down, and there were some graves. But there was a village there, a small village that had been totally destroyed. The beautiful orchards, the doors were hanging sideways, the windows had been blown out, the roof had collapsed, and there were 3 American graves. And the soldiers had to, they used the rifles and put the bayonets on the ends of the rifles and embedded them in the graves, and then put the soldiers' helmets, and then put the dog tags around the helmets so that they could identify later on by the grave registration companies. There was, I think that was one of the most emotional things that I saw. I saw a lot of destruction. I went through Wurzburg, Berlin, Munich, any number of cities, but to see up close the destruction of that little village, those little farmhouses with, was a shock. And it was particularly so, I think, because we were in this peaceful valley. I was standing in the doorway and I looked across, and it was just a gorgeous green valley. And then I looked down and wow, I just saw that, and I called the other guys and they said, yeah.
So I just want to reiterate, we're going to shift now and kind of get you to Munich and Berlin. But I just want to reiterate, so you were in the Air Force, and tell me your rank and the groups that you were assigned to.
I was in the 442nd Troop Carrier Group that had been part of the first Troop Carrier Command organized in the United States, specifically flying transport planes, carrying paratroopers, towing gliders, taking supplies anywhere they were needed.
And
I was a corporal and I was a flight engineer after I had been through airplane engine mechanic school or tech school, and had reached the rank of corporal and was at that time in command of an aircraft as a flight engineer.
And you guys were connected to the Army, an Army division, is that correct?
No,
What, you said
No.
it's 182nd or it's 282nd?
well, yeah, what, we transported paratroopers of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne.
Okay.
I was attached to that group, so wherever they went, we took them. If they needed to jump, we loaded them and we dropped them and went back for more. So yes, in that respect, we were attached to the 82nd Airborne Division, the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. These were battle-trained guys. Many of them had jumped during the war, and they were instructors, and they were with us. And I was, when they didn't have a jump master, that when we were flying over the targets, I became the jump master. I would say, we have a red light, stand up and hook up. When the green light is on, I would yell, stand up and hook up, number one at the door. And so they would line up, and as soon as the green light came on, out they went the door. If they didn't go right away, we pushed them out.
Okay. All right, so you arrived briefly at First and Feldbruck. That's your first stop in
Yes.
Germany.
Yes, we were there to get organized. That was my first base.
Any memories of First and Feldbruck?
Had been a Luftwaffe, a German Air Force school, and I remember the barracks, the mess halls. Part of it had been destroyed, but part of it had been saved. And I remember they had swastikas decorating even the washrooms where we were, and they had the names of Hermann Goering and the different generals, Hitler's, and on the walls. So yeah, it had been an important air base.
And then from First and Feld, you were there just a few days?
Yes, just probably maybe a week or so, a few days, and then we went to Munich to, it was a military designation, R82. Munich had been Lufthansa airfield before the war, or Lufthansa airport, and it is now again Lufthansa airline base.
And so then what's your first memories of Munich and and that airport and the what living conditions, I guess?
The living conditions?
Yeah.
Yeah. We hadn't had time to construct barracks or anything. We were living in tents, 4 men to a tent. Our mess hall was a huge tent with pot-bellied stoves all over the place. My sleeping quarters were 8 by 10 or so, 10 by 10 tent with 4 guys sleeping there. We went from there to the tents and mess halls, the tent also. Conditions were very rudimentary, but we had over 90% of us were 18, 19, 20 years old. I was the youngest one in that whole group, and I had just turned 18. And we had, a little later, we got some older people there. But the conditions were quite rudimentary.
Cold?
Cold all the time. We showered. They had made some makeshift showers using aircraft gasoline or fuel tanks, and hid them with a fire underneath them. Then we took a shower, went from the tents in our flying gear to take a shower, and hadn't put that heavy gear on again to go to the snow to get to our tents. And it was miserably cold all the time, so we traveled with all our heavy gear on.
Was the tent heated at all?
We had a pot-bellied stove in the middle, and so the Germans delivered coal to us. We had a bin of coal, and German prisoners, Polish, Romanian, Czechoslovakian people that had been taken over by the Army, the Air Forces from the Germans. So they delivered coal to us, and we kept the fire going day and night. And so you can imagine what conditions at that tent were like.
So you're 18 and you spent Christmas of 1945 in the snow in a tent in Munich.
Yes.
Any memories? Any memories
Oh yeah.
of Christmas, 1945 in the snow?
Well, we left the base. It was we were outside somewhere between Dachau, concentration camp in Munich, and so we went out and we cut a branch off of a tree, brought that in and put it in the tent, and the Munich base had been a fighter assembly, underground fighter assembly factory. So we found a lot of foil and bright metal and brought those things and cut them into shape and decorated that branch of that tree as a Christmas tree. And you know, the mess hall did whatever they could. They gave us mashed potatoes, I don't know, turkey or some kind of meat, you know. So yeah.
Very quickly, did you go into those underground factories?
Yes, we did.
Where they'd been blown up pretty much?
They were under probably 10, 15 feet of concrete. So there were lights on opposite ends of the field. So they brought in the fuselages, the bodies of the aircraft and the wings and propellers and so on, and brought them underground, and they would assemble the fighter there, take it out in the darkness, and they had these lights that came up out of the ground and lit up the runway for them. There was a dirt runway, and they would take the fighter aircraft from there. So it was full of aircraft parts and concrete and oil and all kinds of debris from the war.
This question is stepping back a little bit about thinking about your brother and your reasons for being there. Keeping in mind that Germany was responsible for World War II in Europe, what were your feelings at the time when you heard that your job would be actually connected with supplying Germans with goods and services they need? Did you feel resentment, or did the people around you, did you hear other Americans expressing resentment about having to help the Germans so shortly after the war?
You have to know that GIs grumbled about everything. It didn't make any what the hell that was. They were grumbling about everything. A lot of them did. I can honestly say that I had no resentment. I was doing what I wanted to do, which was flying. I had no resentment against the Germans. No, that's very clear in my mind. I think I talked with Ernest, and he suffered. My brothers in England suffered day and night, loading the bombers and fighters to go on the air raids. But you know, I've always been a very positive person, and I think I volunteered. I didn't feel the urge to grumble. I was doing what I wanted to do. If it was helping the Germans, well, it was helping the Germans. We were relatively safe and warm. We had a base. And we were doing what we were requested to do. I never felt any resentment, and I did talk with the Germans from time to time. Yes, I did. I met some. Yes.
We're going to switch now away from Munich to Tempelhof in Berlin.
Okay.
So this is kind of a little bit of a break and kind of the start at about 30 minutes in here. So what's your first memory, or what memories do you have of first arriving to Tempelhof Airport and Berlin?
You have to know, and I mentioned this before, I did not spend any long periods of time in Tempelhof. My mission was primarily to deliver supplies. Before the airlift in Berlin, we delivered food, clothing, rice, oil, ammunition, whatever the troops that were stationed in Berlin needed. That's what I did. I did that before the Berlin airlift, and I flew in and out a lot of times. We flew. I was a gypsy aircraft. I flew many different types of missions, but one of the ones that we were called on to was to deliver supplies, because the Russians were already there. We were on the West Berlin, and the Russians had indicated, we want West Berlin. We have East Berlin, we'll take the rest of it. And the Allied government said no. So, and they started moving in their armor and tanks and all, and surrounding even, and so when the Americans realized, became totally aware that they needed to do something to keep, they made a concrete decision, whatever it took to defend West Berlin, they were going to do it. So they, after the Russians had surrounded with all of their armor, they pulled armor from all over Europe and surrounded East Berlin, or West Berlin, excuse me. And so we needed to keep the Berlin citizens and our troops alive. I'm not sure if the Germans understand the significance of that, of how they survived in West Berlin, but they did because of what we did. We brought everything they needed. They had very little. They had been through hell, going through hell, and so we felt a sense of purpose here. We flew whatever they needed.
Do you remember about what time your first missions went into Berlin? You must have been at the end of 45 and in the early part of 46. I don't know.
Yeah, it was in late 45. There were so many missions that because I flew into Tempelhof. I ended up at Bremerhaven or Bremen or in Munich, picking up supplies, taking VIPs, whatever needed to be done. So I went in there from time to time. I don't think I can tell you exactly when, if we knew when the exact time that, all over the period of time, there was an exact time when the Russians started surrounding East Berlin. So I'm not sure I can clarify that.
Do you have could you give a rough count of how many times you flew into Berlin, do you think? 20, 50?
Oh, I think, once I had flown many times into West Berlin, into Tempelhof, and then we became part of the steady stream of aircraft delivering supplies. The Allies decided we're not going to give up West Berlin, bring in those transports, and that was our primary purpose, was to deliver whatever they needed. I have no idea. I remember when my first flight was there. No.
How many? 50, do you think?
Countless times. I don't think we ever kept track of them. We were busy loading and unloading and flying to bases in Germany and France and England, bringing supplies.
You couldn't guess a number?
15 or 20 times probably, yeah.
We talked about you talked a little bit about the cargoes. Talk about the dangers of flying in and out of Tempelhof.
Tempelhof and every other base in England, France, Germany, wherever we were, weather was a factor. That was something that we fought constantly. The weather was something that we feared because we were loaded. We iced over. So weather was a factor in Europe always,
You flew into Tempelhof with zero visibility?
with very little visibility. We couldn't even see where we were. We were being guided. They had landing zone instructions, so the pilots were tuned in, and they were going by compass reading. We were watching the compass. It was so foggy we couldn't see, and till we got lower. But we were a constant train of aircraft, one right after the other. I've heard that we were every 3 to 5 minutes there was a landing aircraft. So if a problem occurred in landing, the idea was to get that aircraft off the runway, push it off with tractors, whatever, and because there was another aircraft right behind there, you could just see the planes as they disappeared through the fog and landing. And there are some pictures I've seen where there are 8 or 10 aircraft. So we were landing, and as soon as the propeller stopped turning, the GIs came in their trucks, backed up, and I supervised the unloading, and we unloaded supplies. And as soon as that lead plane was unloaded and took off, and as they unloaded us, we took off again. While they were unloading, if we were 4th, 5th, 6th in line, they brought us sandwiches, so we went to a mess hall that was near there, and they served us coffee and donuts and sandwiches, and they had a runner that let us know you're unloaded, ready for takeoff. So it was touch and go. It was very tightly planned, rigorously controlled to avoid as many accidents as possible. Yet we lost maybe 60, 70 air crewmen. Each of those air transports had 3 crewmen, so you can imagine how many aircraft were destroyed.
So one of the dangers you mentioned was carrying munitions and fuel. Could you talk about that?
The weather, and there was always a factor, as I mentioned. Along with that, we carried ammunition. What they couldn't get, you have to remember, they were surrounded. The Russians weren't letting any ground traffic in. Whatever they needed, we were their lifeline. So we took tank shells, we took food, clothing, ammunition, gasoline, whatever supplies the Berlin command needed, we picked up. We were constantly on the go, and we knew how important our mission was. Yes, and I think we mentioned this. Russian MiGs, fighter aircraft, were patrolling that area, so we were aware of our presence in the area. If we were coming, we could look out and see Russian aircraft fighters.
I'm going to get back. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. So, if you were aware that if you have a mishap with a plane full of fuel, it's not a good situation.
it was going to be a disaster. We knew that. We absolutely knew it. So we were as alert as you could possibly be, and the pilots knew this. And we were warned constantly, stay alert, stay alert, stay alert. You know, we're on final means you're ready to land, and there's no aborting. We were so loaded you couldn't abort that aircraft. Aborting means leaving your landing instructions. We had to land, and if there was a plane in the way, we needed to land as safely as we could.
You talked about the danger of your cargo moving in the plane and crashing with this fuel.
Everything we put on board that aircraft, we had tie-down rings on the floor of the aircraft, and we had these big straps. Every item that we had was in a case or a carrier of some kind and strapped to the aircraft. If airplane went sideways in the air and that fuel tank got loose, you can imagine what would happen. But any supplies, so everything had to be. That was my supervision. The guys that helped me load that aircraft, I checked every strap to make sure that whatever we were carrying was strapped down so it didn't move inside the aircraft.
And you, last thing about the dangers of Tempelhof, I've seen pictures of the apartment buildings right there on the approach, and apparently they lost some planes coming in. Right in, you know, you had to come in right over these.
Pattern.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we were flying over the buildings. Berlin is a big city, and the airport is not on the outer edges of it. You've been there. We were flying, so yeah, into the buildings. If that happened, it happened. The dangers.
So, what other specific jobs I think you mentioned this at Tempelhof? You were in charge of the loading and unloading of the cargo.
Yes.
And what else?
The flight engineer. I was the on-ground commander of that aircraft. The pilots depended on me to load correctly, to unload correctly, to refuel that aircraft. That's the other thing that we had to do. As we unloaded, we called for fuel, and we had to refuel the aircraft before we took off. We flew, depending where we were, we flew with less fuel than we normally carried, because that enhanced the load. We could put more supplies in the aircraft if we carried less fuel. So, but that was something that was always present in our minds. But I supervised all the loading and unloading, always. I was never away from an aircraft when it was being loaded or unloaded, because those guys, if they weren't careful, would ram an airplane with a truck, or hit the door and bend the door, and then it wouldn't sit. And that was a problem, and we had to take off. We didn't have time even for repairs.
Did you have contact with Germans at Tempelhof?
I did not. I'm sure there were German prisoners of war, or maybe Polish or Czechoslovakian, Romanians. They were all over Germany on American bases. We had to take them over from the Russians, and so we used them. Literally used them. We had them do all kinds of maintenance for us, not on our aircraft, but helping clean up the bases.
You apparently had an accident in which you nearly took out the tower, the air traffic control tower at Tempelhof. Could you tell us that story?
We had a heavy load on takeoff. What we had done, they had brought paratroopers. They were constantly training, so that's one thing that we did. We were attached to the 82nd Airborne, so we transported them. we, instead of going back for a load, we took a load of 30 paratroopers. That's overloading the aircraft. 3 air crewmen, 2 pilots, and the engineer, myself, and 30 paratroopers. We took off from Tempelhof, and there was wind shear, a wind going crosswise across the runway, and the plane deviated from its takeoff pattern and headed straight for the tower. It was only a few feet as we took a violent maneuver to the left. I remember that I was standing up with my hand on the aircraft fuel pump in case one of the engines failed, and I could see the control tower operators blinking 2 red lights indicating a danger signal. And as we flew over, we could see those guys crouching behind the windows of the tower. It was very, very close.
And you moved to the left, or you missed them over the top?
No, we moved to the left. They were right below us as we made it. Took the evasive maneuver. They were right below us. I could look as I went. I was standing up between the pilot and co-pilot, and I could look and see the guys facing us.
What were you thinking at the time?
Well, I just thought, this is it. This is it. That's all I could think of. I had my hand on the fuel pump, which was not electric, it was a manual. In case the electric fuel pump failed, and I had my vision on the fuel gauges, and I could tell if they flickered that engines weren't getting fuel. So I stood up and had my hand. It was a red handled red colored handle, and I was ready to pump that if the fuel gauge indicated fuel was not getting to one of the engines. So yeah, and the pilots didn't say anything. They looked at me and looked at each other and shook their heads, and they knew they had just escaped.
Were they at fault? Were they in air?
They were at fault. They had been flying constantly like us, and they had gone out to a Red Cross club or something, I think, which was a no-no. You weren't supposed to drink 24 hours before you flew, and I was not a drinker, so I never had a problem with that. But those guys were under a lot of pressure, and they were decompressing, I think, and they realized almost belatedly they were in real serious danger. And we had these 30 paratroopers on board, with fully loaded with all of their gear on. We don't know. So yeah.
Are you doing okay? Can we go 15 more minutes, or you need to take a break?
No, we can go ahead. Let's do it. Let's go ahead and finish.
Okay. So the Russians, we're going to kind of jump to the Russians here a little bit. Did you have a sense that the conflict between the initiation of the Cold War, did you have a sense that the conflict could spiral out of control and become violent again?
We knew that. I don't think there was any question in our mind. We were flying and being trailed by Russian MiGs wherever we went. If we flew from Munich to Austria on a mission, they were there. We flew sometimes with air cover from fighter aircraft because they were there. And on one of the occasions, they were. This friend of mine was flying on a mission to Austria, and the fighter came up and very, very close, and they said, "Go down." And the pilot said no, and they said, looked up, and there were 2 fighters up above.
American fighters?
American fighters, and so these MiGs pulled away. But they fired on one of the aircraft and damaged the wing, inches away from the fuel tanks.
So you had that plane you said had, when it actually was forced down and they shot at it, and then...
Yes.
And then what happened?
We had instructions and we had practices short field landings and takeoffs, which meant that we found a clearing in the forest and went down as low as we could, sometimes right above the trees. It was an evasive maneuver, but it was also in case of an emergency, and so we went down low and then pulled up out of there, and usually there were very short, clear spaces, and so we would pull out of there and practice that constantly. We were constantly in a training mode wherever we were. It didn't make a difference where we were. We had to be very alert because of the weather primarily, all the time, always there was a weather, and whatever gear or fuel supplies, whatever, oil tanks, whatever we carried.
You told another story about you were in formation and two planes collided in
Yes,
air.
Yes.
And go ahead and tell the story if you could.
So we took off there. We flew what they call in elements of three aircraft: a lead aircraft, which would be the commander of the flight, and one on the left, one on the right, and the lead aircraft was flying just ahead. The plane on the right-hand side, which was the flight engineer was a good friend of mine. We went into a heavy bank of clouds, which I mentioned over and over again. The clouds were always present, and these two, for some strange reason, this pilot lost contact or lost his bearings and collided with the tail of the lead aircraft. It was damaged enough to land, but the aircraft that caused the collision went down. It was damaged. It hit an engine and caught fire, and so they had to bail.
Did you see it, or was it too
Yes.
cloudy?
We were on the left. We heard Mayday. We heard that's the international signal. We're going down. We have a problem. We're going to crash. So we heard Mayday, Mayday, and we looked, and these two planes had disappeared. And so we circled, and we answered that Mayday call, and we gave our bearings where we were. We had a radio compass right above the pilots, and we gave the bearings, and they sent some aircraft to look for the two aircraft that had fallen.
And did the crew survive?
Yes, the crew of the aircraft that crashed survived. They bailed out, and from some base in Germany, they sent a convoy with probably paratroopers or soldiers in it, and I was in the forest, in the woods. We didn't know who was hiding out. We knew that many German soldiers had deserted and were living away from population centers, so we didn't know what was going to happen. So, and they picked up the air crew.
Did you know that they had bailed when you were in the air?
Yes.
How did you know?
Well, when we heard the Mayday, that means we're going down. That tells you it's a danger signal, but it means you're in trouble. It means we're falling. We're going down. So Mayday indicated to us right away that, and the only thing we could think of, they had collided, because we could, at this moment before we had seen the aircraft, and then we didn't hear the crash, of course, but we heard the Mayday, the big yell, Mayday, 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 and we looked, and two planes had disappeared.
And is there some signal they gave you, say we're jumping out or something, or no?
No, we heard Mayday,
Yeah.
and yes, they did. They said, we're bailing, Mayday, bailing, Mayday, bailing. And I had looked at my compass, and I knew what the heading was, so we put out the heading so that any aircraft, if there were any aircraft in the area, they would know where we were, where the crash had occurred.
And you told about they ended up in a tree in a farm or something?
The flight engineer, I don't know about the pilots, they apparently landed safely, but the flight engineer ended up in a tree. He was up in a tree about 100, 200 feet off the ground, and they landed on some farmland and forest land, and some farmers came out there when they saw the plane go down and saw these parachutes. They headed out in that area and got to Marshall, who was hanging in his harness in the parachute, and they helped him get down, and then he wanted a parachute, so he had them cut the branch of the tree, and he needed a souvenir of why he would think of that at the time we had just escaped with his life. But they cut the parachute down and gave it to him.
Did he show it to you?
Oh yeah, he brought it home. Yeah, we left Germany together and spent some time in San Antonio and in Dallas. We were good friends.
You there were other dangers. You mentioned you lost another friend in a bomb crater.
Yeah, whenever you left the base, we were always armed, always a sidearm of 45. If there were 2 or 3, we carried carbines or rifles. This friend, I was on a flight away from my base, and he was a good friend of mine. We were working with some young Hitler Youth, organizing a baseball team through the Red Cross, and he was going to work with the kids and was in what they call a weapons carrier, and the front of it is open and it has a canvas back over the bed of the truck, and he drove that into a bomb hole, and there were thousands of bomb holes all over. They had dropped millions of pounds of bombs all over Germany. I mean, wherever you went, you could see sometimes the runs of holes as a string of bombs exploded in the ground. So he made a mistake in the dark, in the fog, and drove the truck into a bomb hole off of the main road, and it killed him. So, and he was a good friend. And there were dangers in the Army of Occupation. It wasn't a Sunday picnic at all.
You mentioned the putting the hooks on the trucks when you would go into town.
Yes.
Where was that, and what was it?
All over Germany. The engineers are instructed to pull these angle iron big hooks hook them to the bumpers of the trucks, and put a big hook on the front of them. They were up above the roof of the vehicle, and had a big hook that had been sharpened, and because deserters of the German forces were out all over, and they would get their revenge without any arms at all, unless they were able to steal some. They were out for revenge, so you could get beheaded when they discovered what they were doing. Then they put those hooks on to cut the wires that were spread across the roads, and they put them across the main roads where there was a lot of traffic, in order to decapitate the American soldiers, and they did.
Did you know people who were killed?
No.
Anything more you can tell us about the Hitler Youth on your baseball team?
Well, they were easy to organize. They had been brought up under regimentation. We told them, you're going to do this. This is the field. We drew pictures of them. And they were kids. The older ones were more trained in soldier tactics, but they were young kids, and the Red Cross had given us. They sent sports gear from the United States: basketballs, footballs, soccer balls, all kinds of gear, and so through the Red Cross, we put out a call that Americans are going to organize a baseball team, so the kids didn't have anything to do, and they could be regimented because they were trained that way, but they were real young kids. They had been through all kinds of organizational activities from the time they were I think 6 or 7 years old, we heard all the time to, the older ones are really hard to work with, but they took them at the age of 12, 13, 14, 15 and put them in the armed forces. They trained them as soldiers in the Battle of the Bulge and Bastogne. Your Uncle Ernest captured some of those kids. I mean, they were in rags and freezing, and they were, he said, 12, 13, 14 years old, and they threw down their guns and surrendered. You know, so I often wondered what happened to all those Hitler youth. But that's where
You had fun with them?
yeah. When I was flying, I was with Doug. I flew a lot. I was a gypsy aircraft. My aircraft had been designated as to deliver all kinds of important personnel.
You mentioned Nuremberg and
Yes.
prisoners. Tell us about that.
So we're transporting mostly higher echelon German officers to Nuremberg. So that was part of what we did. We were fully armed. We put on board in cuffs and chains. They didn't have anything to lose. They were our prisoners, and if they rebelled on board the aircraft, they were going to get killed. We flew with guards. I had a gun in the cabin, the control cabin for the radar and the radios were, and everything was sealed off from the rest of the ship. But I had a gun inside there, and I was there all the time. And then each prisoner had one guard at least. So we could carry between 20 and 30 personnel, and so if we had 15 prisoners, we had 15 guards. They didn't take any chances. They were simply told, it's your life.
We're going to wrap it up here in just a second. Berend had asked about other memories of interactions with German people. You had mentioned an interesting friendship, I guess, you developed with the laundry lady.
Yeah, our base was surrounded by barbed wire.
In Munich.
In Munich, yes. R82, and we had all kinds of needs. There were 2 or 3 gates. There were at least 2 guards at each gate, and I met a woman, an elderly woman. I have no idea how old she was. She may have been 60, 70 years old. She was taking care of some German orphans and children without families. And she had those kids scrubbed and cleaned and patched clothing and all, but she needed food for this group. You have to remember there was no food being grown in Germany at that time. I mean, the fields were devastated. They didn't have supplies and no replacement. The German population was really suffering. And I can tell you some other interesting things there too. I met her at the gate. And they taught her the word laundry, clothes, uniform, and we said, yeah. So she said, bitte, we said, please. So we gave her the clothes, and she washed them, and she would bring the kids. They would bring the loads of clothes to us, and I paid her in salt, flour, whatever I could from the mess hall, chocolate, K-rations, crackers, gum, candy, anything that we get from the PX. And with those kids and for her, I mean, I gave her some coffee. That was a precious commodity. I'll tell you something interesting too. I went to the mess hall. It was, she said, café, café, café. So I gave her what I had, and I went to the mess hall and took some cans from the mess hall. They had opened up lots of cans. They fed us with a lot of canned food all the time. That's primarily what we had there, no fresh food. So I got these cans. I went to the mess sergeant and I said, coffee grounds. And he said, oh, hey man, he said, there's barrels of coffee grounds. What are you going to do with that? I said, there's a woman with a bunch of kids and keeps asking for coffee. And he said, Jesus, Jim, he said, you can't carry that barrel, but fill those cans, you know, give her all those cans. And this is hard to believe. She would take those grounds and they would boil them. They put them through the big 5-gallon coffee makers on the base, and then when they were done, they'd take these scrub barrels and put the coffee grounds in there. So I filled those up and I talked to her, and she just, and she gave each of those kids one of those cans of coffee. I took another guy with me, and we took these cans of coffee grounds. They took us home and they boiled the hell out of them till they almost got white, and then they would take the coffee grounds and in their little containers they were trying to grow vegetables in, they would use that for fertilizer. But they would take those grounds and boil them till they came out almost clear water. That's how bad things were for them, and how we were. That was my interaction, and that was a good gesture on the part of this woman who she even pressed my underwear, everything. She was a typical German housewife, organized. Those kids were scrubbed clean. They were patched, but they were clean. They had raggedy coats, you know, we gave them whatever we had, you know. But she took care of those kids. She was a grandma with these orphan kids.
Well, we didn't get to the black market, so that's maybe another one if Baron is interested.
I'm not sure if that's safe.
But final thoughts about your time at Tempelhof and Germany? Anything you didn't get to that occurs to you that you want to share?
So clarify your questions, Mijo.
Are there any final thoughts about your time in Germany or at Tempelhof that you?
Well, yes. I could have re-enlisted and stayed in Germany. I was offered a bigger aircraft, a possibility of officer training in the United States or somewhere in England. I thought my service was over there. I was flying and I accomplished what I wanted to do, and so I've always been glad, always, and you have to remember the dangers that I outlined, but I grew up at that time. I spent a year and a half and probably grew up 4 or 5 years at that time as a commander of an aircraft under dangerous conditions, always the weather, Russian aircraft, flying over the oceans, always the danger of an engine quitting, an aircraft going down. But I grew up. I've always considered that one of the big events in my life. First, I came back at 19, mature beyond being 19 and out of high school. Yeah, I grew up. I really did.
And then, any thoughts about the memorial that I showed you from Tempelhof?
Gratefulness. I didn't know any of those guys. I never saw those. They said we knew those aircraft had crashed, and yeah, we knew. We got together on a different basis when we were pulling this stuff, and I talked to those guys. We commiserated about where we were picking up supplies, what we were carrying, and their landing and all. But we knew the aircraft and the skeletons were laying around of the aircraft. We knew these guys had perished there. Yeah, I mentioned their gratefulness that they took care, that they constructed a memorial to them. They didn't get to come home.
Final thoughts for people of Berlin Templar, the museum.
Just gratefulness that the Germans thought enough of our efforts to put a memorial.
Thank you.